YouTube, earlier today we got the official Series 12 rule set released. It's going to be 2 restricteds with Dynamax allowed, and I thought why not rank every single restricted duo that we could possibly use in the format in one tier list. Let's get started with this tier list and rank some duos. All right, let's start ranking things because we have a lot of duos to cover. Now, when I first had the idea for this video, I didn't think there'd be so many duos, but yeah, scrolling through the list, as you can see from your screen, it's we have a lot of ground to cover here today. So yeah, we are going to go by as quick as possible, and I'm going to give brief explanations. Might not be the most in-depth thing, but there's freaking over 240 duos, and there's actually more. There's probably like 300 in combined. But for simplicity's sakes, you might notice that there are some single Pokemon not with like another partner, I would say. And the reason for that is I would not really use these Pokemon, and even if you pair it up with a stronger restricted, it's probably still gonna like hurt the entire duo and the team down. So I am going to make this for simplicity's sake right here. So let's get started with the never used tier. And I mean, just never have these in your team builder. There's absolutely no point. And it is going to be Cosmog, because Cosmog only gets like teleport and doesn't really do anything for restricted. It's a waste of a slot. Cosmium, or whatever this Pokemon is called, same thing, just literally a waste of a restricted slot. Just never use this Pokemon. And there are 2 more I would say in the never used slots. This is going to be the regular Calyrex, the grass psychic one, and the one that's supposed to have this giant brain, but literally it's just like I mean, grass psychic, really bad typing, no point of really using this one. Its stats are pretty sad as well. I mean, just no point of using this Pokemon. There's really no point. And then the last one is Zygarde Dog. Now Zygarde Dog, of course, can transform into the big dog, of course, but speed, space 115, it's not that great, I would say. And yeah, I just think that there's really no point of using this. Its bulk is pretty bad, and the speed here isn't even that great. I just wouldn't see a usage for like the 50 or the 10% Zygarde compared to the 50% Zygarde. So I would never really use this. All right, let's get started with the F tier. Now, these are Pokemon that I would say, even with a restricted duo, like another restricted, it's just not going to save them. These restricteds are just going to like really just make it, you know, regardless of whether you have these Pokemon or not, it's just not going to help out. It's basically like you're going to be using one restricted for the most part. So regular Necrozma, but there's just not really reason to. Plain Psychic type, its coverage isn't that great, its stats aren't like super impressive. Prism Armor is cool, but yeah, I mean, just use Dustmane or Dawn Wings. It's just better overall, so I don't really see a point of using plain and Necrozma here. The next Pokemon I would say is going to be Giratina Origin. Now, I like Giratina Origin personally. I think it's a cool design, but I mean, there's a Pokemon called Dragapult, and in a Dynamax format, Dragapult is literally everything Giratina wants to be. There's literally no point of using regular Giratina other than Levitate, but even then, it's not that great. It needs a held item in order to keep its form. It's not good at all, really. Ghost Dragon, its speed is pretty low. Its bulk is decent, I'll give it that, but otherwise, like, Dragapult just has like better offenses, way better speed, better as a support and offensive Pokemon. There's just, it has better coverage too. Like, I just don't see a reason to use regular Giratina. Like, there's just no point. I'd also say probably Kyurem. I don't know if it'd be here. I'd probably put it here. I mean, there's no reason to use regular Kyurem over Kyurem Black and Kyurem White. It does get Glaciate, I guess, but I mean, Icy Wind not really like super important. I feel like Freeze Dry, you know, makes it better than these, of course. So yeah, I mean, but there's still really no point of using this when Kyurem Black and Kyurem White exist, which are way better like forms of it, of course. And the next Pokemon I would say would probably be the Zamazenta regular form. This is the non-crown version. It's just like, I mean, pure fighting. I feel like its stats aren't like amazing. It gets a +1 defense. It's just, it gets a few support moves, but I feel like it's just pretty wasted on a restricted slot. I feel like there's not really a point of using this in general in the Dynamax format. So I think like not having the Steel type 2 really hurts it, because Steel type, of course, is such a big, you know, resist factor. So let's say that regular Zamazenta, no matter what duo you pair it up with, is probably not going to be that great. Same with regular Zacian, but at least Zacian gets the attack boost still. And Pure Fairy is not terrible, of course, but I mean, I just feel like it's not that great. It's still frail, missing out the speed tier. The fact that its crown form is literally like way better and will beat it every time. It's just like, I feel like it drags down a lot of teams. The steel type being lost is also like pretty big. So yeah, I wouldn't really recommend this Pokemon. The next one I would say is probably Giratina, the altered form. And you know, this is better than the origin form at least, because this can at least run an item. It's decently bulky, so at least like, you know, it has some merits, you know, like it's a bulky version, which, you know, Dragapult isn't supposed to be a bulky Pokemon. This one's supposed to be more of an offensive Pokemon. This one's supposed to be a bulkier variant. This one can use a held item, you know, better than the origin form, but still not that great in comparison. It's really just like doesn't really tank the attack super well, but also like doesn't dish out enough damage. There's a lot of common threats that really threaten Giratina. So not a big fan of it in general. Lugia, anything you pair with Lugia, I'm sorry, this Pokemon, it gets Tailwind, it gets like Calm Mind, Multi-Scale is nice, Recovery, but it, even with like a policy boost, for instance, it's so weak. And I mean so weak, it's actually pitiful. It gets walled by like Incineroar if it's especially defensive. It's not that great of a Pokemon. It really isn't. And then the last Pokemon for F tier is Mewtwo. And I kind of want to disagree, because I think like there's some Mewtwo pairings that, you know, might be better than like some of the others. But I felt like when I was trying to justify Mewtwo, like I think Mewtwo was probably better in like, you know, Series 10 and maybe even some parts of Series 11 with the single restricted, because, you know, there were some moments where Mewtwo was probably better and, you know, could be better than like Calyrex because of its coverage, even though its speed isn't that great. But like Calyrex Shadow Rider is just such a better offensive Pokemon. It literally gets the same ability in a nerf with like the special attack increase if it gets a KO. It's faster, way more threatening. I just feel like there is going to be like a lot of Pokemon that Mewtwo's not really going to enjoy facing this format, especially if Grimmsnarl is going to be as common as I think it's going to be. I just don't really see that much hope of it in a restricted Pokemon paired with another. So yeah, especially in the 2 restricted, Mewtwo's not exactly the bulkiest Pokemon, and it's not really that worth it. Misses a lot of KOs. So yeah, I'm going to put Mewtwo probably at the top of F tier. I think it's better than these by quite a far, but yeah, still not like amazing, even with like whatever partner it has next to it. All right, so we have a lot of restricted duos here. As you can see, the E tier is basically where I'm going to put like every single matching type, where it doesn't really make sense to have like 2 dragon types, for instance, in a format where Zacian and Fairies are going to be like 2 ice types aren't really great together, etc., like Kyurem White plus Calyrex, for instance. So I'm going to be putting basically every single like matching type where synergy doesn't really work out that great, I think, in this tier. So just going to call out the duos basically of, you know, what's going to go in this tier. Calyrex Ice Rider, Kyurem Black. Calyrex Ice Rider, Kyurem White. Even though these are pretty strong offensive Pokemon, it's just not really worth it. Calyrex Ice Rider plus the Necrozma Dawnwings. Calyrex Shadow Rider plus Lunala. Calyrex Shadow Rider plus Necrozma Dawnwings. Dialga plus Eternatus. Eternatus plus Kyurem Black. Eternatus plus Palkia. Dialga plus Rayquaza. Eternatus plus Kyurem White. Eternatus plus Rayquaza. Eternatus plus Reshiram. Eternatus plus Zekrom. Dialga plus Kyurem Black. Kyurem Black plus Zekrom. Kyurem Black plus Ray. Kyurem Black plus Palkia. Kyurem White plus Dialga. Solgaleo plus Lunala. I'm sorry, Ashton and Jeremy. I know you brought this to the World Championship in 2019, but it's still going to be pretty bad regardless. Rayquaza plus Kyurem White. Kyurem White plus Palkia. Kyurem White plus Reshiram. Kyurem White plus Zekrom. Kyurem Black plus Reshiram. Necrozma Dustbane plus Lunala. Dialga plus Palkia. Dialga plus Reshiram. Zygarde plus Palkia. Zygarde plus Zekrom. Zygarde plus Reshiram. Zygarde plus Rayquaza. Zygarde plus Kyurem White. Zygarde plus Kyurem Black. Zygarde plus Dialga. Zamazenta plus Solgaleo. Zekrom plus Rayquaza. Reshiram plus Palkia. Palkia plus Rayquaza. Zamazenta plus Zacian. Rayquaza plus Ho-Oh. Sorry, if you had Delta Stream, maybe you wouldn't be an E tier. Necrozma Dustbane plus Dialga. Necrozma Dawnwings plus Lunala. Reshiram plus Ho-Oh. Solgaleo plus Dialga. Necrozma Dawnwings plus Solgaleo. Reshiram plus Rayquaza. Rayquaza plus Yveltal might not be as bad as E, but it is double flying. They share a weakness to Fairy as well. Not exactly that great. Zekrom plus Palkia. Duskmane, Necrozma, and Solgaleo. Steel types are great, but they both kind of want the weakness policy generally. Not that amazing together, I feel like. Zamazenta plus Dialga. Zamazenta plus Necrozma, Duskmane. Zekrom plus Dialga. And Zekrom plus Reshiram. At least they have the Fusion Flare Fusion Bolt combination, but the shared weaknesses with Ground Dragon is pretty bad. So it'd probably be like top of V. Not really ordering these Pokemon duos, by the way, since most of them are just going to share a lot of weaknesses together, and it's not exactly that amazing. So I don't think it's really going to matter too much. And that is the E tier. I feel like a lot of these Pokemon, they do have like a lot of shared weaknesses. They don't really complement each other well. So I would say that they aren't really like a great duo together. They don't really synergize well. There's a few exceptions with the typing that actually, you know, synergize well. So I'd probably put them higher. But this should be for the most part. And if I missed any, I'll just add it to the E tier later on. And now we're going to move on to the D tier. This is going to be like duos that, like, you know, don't share the same weaknesses, but I just don't really understand why you would pair them together, as I just don't think they have enough synergy to like really complement one another. That would include Yveltal Reshiram, Yveltal Zekrom, Solgaleo Zekrom, Zacian Lunala. Could be decent, but with Max, I just don't think this is that great with Dynamax, because Lunala is just not really a good Pokemon with Dynamax allowed. Ice Rider Calyx plus Necrozma Duskmane. Oh, Calyx Ice Rider plus Lunala to E tier. Calyx Ice Rider plus Dialga to D tier. Solgaleo plus Xerneas. Calyx Shadow Rider plus Dialga. Calyx Ice Rider plus Ho-Oh. Zacian plus Necrozma Duskmane. So I feel like because Steel is really good, I think this is an exception. And Necrozma Duskmane with the Steel Spike boost and the Max Quake boost can really, like, you know, threaten him with weakness policy, and Zacian's just a really good restricted. So I think this is one of the exceptions with the duos where it's also just going to be, you know, going to be stronger than like a lot of these combinations. They share some of the weaknesses, but their individual power is like pretty huge. So that's why I would probably move it up a tier from like the rest of them. So I'm gonna add it to D tier, as well as Zacian Solgaleo added to the D tier. Necrozma Dawnwings plus Kyurem Black. Lunala plus Kyurem White. Lunala plus Palkia. Lunala plus Eternatus. Lunala plus Rayquaza. Zamazenta plus Palkia. Zamazenta plus Groudon. Zamazenta plus Ho. I think Zamazenta, Groudon, and Zamazenta Ho are probably like okay, because like there's coaching stuff in Wide Guard, I guess. But overall, I just never felt like it was really worth it. I feel like when you could just run Zacian as a way more offensive tool, and it's probably like better typing overall paired with these restricted. So I feel like there's not really as much of a point as running Zamazenta paired with like the Groudon Ho. So that's why I put it in D tier. Zamazenta plus Kyurem Black. Zamazenta plus Kyurem White. Zamazenta plus Kyogre. Zamazenta plus Lunala. Zamazenta plus Ray. At least there's Airstream, but it's still not like an amazing duo. Zamazenta plus Reshiram. Zamazenta plus Xerneas. Zamazenta plus Necrozma Dawnwings. Zamazenta plus Zekrom. Zamazenta plus Yveltal. Zamazenta plus Zygarde. I haven't tested this enough, but it does seem pretty average. And Incineroar and Intimidate just in general seems really bad for this. I guess you could go for like coaching plus like oil stuff to negate the Intimidate, but I feel like it takes long to set up, and you like have no damage up with these restricted. So yeah, I don't think it would be that great together. Calyx Shadow Rider plus the Zygarde just feels like it's really big into Incineroar food. Zamazenta plus Calyx Shadow Rider. Shadow Rider Calyx plus the Necrozma Duskmane. I feel like Boldo strats could be a thing, but I feel like it's just better off to have Spectrier instead of your restricted slot. Maybe it's a decent duo. I do think that with the double psychic weakness, it's not amazing either. So that's why I'm putting it in D tier. I think it's a better combination than a lot of the stuff in E tier, but yeah, it's not like an amazing combination, so I'd still put it in D. Same with Solgaleo plus the Calyx Shadow Rider as well. Eternatus plus Necrozma Dawnwings. I don't really see the synergy really between them. Calyx Shadow Rider plus Kyurem Black. Not really that much typing synergy to go on there. Zekrom plus Calyx Shadow Rider, don't really see a type synergy, what they help with against each other. Calyx Shadow Rider plus Reshiram maybe could do stuff, but I feel like it's probably just weak overall. Lunala plus Kieran Black. Lunala plus Xerneas. Lunala plus Zekrom. Lunala plus Zygarde. Eternatus plus Zamazenta. Eternatus plus Zygarde also added to E tier because I forgot about these. Double Dragon, not really that helpful. Double weak to Ice, Dragon, Fairy. Kieran White plus Ho-Oh. Necrozma Dustmane plus Reshiram. Necrozma Dustmane plus Xerneas. Calyx Ice Rider plus Zamazenta. Ice Rider Calyx plus Xerneas. Ice Rider plus the Solgaleo. Ice Rider plus Zacian, both really weak to Zacian. Ice Rider plus Palkia, I feel like just shares a pretty big player of Zacian weakness. I think it probably can be decent with the coverage that it gets, but I just am not too sure at the moment. I'd probably put it in D. Lunala plus Kyogre. If Lunala maybe got Tailwind, maybe this could be a bit higher, but the fact that it doesn't get Tailwind and only Trick Room is an option, and Lunala, again, not a great Dynamax Pokemon in this format, which is why a lot of the Lunala duos are pretty low. I just don't really see it helping out too much, so I'm gonna put it in D tier. Kieran Black plus Ho-Oh in D. They share rock weaknesses, not exactly super amazing here. Lunala plus Yveltal, not really much, and Calyx Shadow Rider plus Yveltal is probably way stronger, so I'd probably put this in D. Lunala plus Dialga, again, not super amazing. Lunala not that great in this format. I'd probably put it in D. Lunala plus Ho-Oh, not exactly that great. They don't really like complement each other too much. Lunala plus Reshiram, I guess there's Trick Room stuff, but again, not really the best compliments. Lunala plus Groudon's probably like higher D, but I just can't really see it being anything higher than like low C at the most. I'd probably put in like a higher D tier, but overall, like again, I just think Lunala is really underwhelming in a Dynamax format, so I'm gonna put it in D tier. Necrozma Dawnwings plus Ho-Oh. I think Necrozma Dawnwings also suffers a lot from like Max Darkness, Max Ghost being really weak to that in Dynamax form, so I feel like a lot of Necrozma Dawnwing teams are also just going to be like pretty low in D tier, so it doesn't really synergize well with much either. Necrozma Dawnwings plus Kieran White. Necrozma Dawnwings plus Palkia. Necrozma Dawnwings plus Rayquaza. Necrozma Dawnwings plus Yveltal. Necrozma Dawnwings plus Dialga. Necrozma Dustmane plus Kieran Black. Necrozma Dustmane plus Kieran White. Necrozma Dawnwings plus Reshiram. Necrozma Dawnwings plus Zekrom. Necrozma Dawnwings plus Zygarde. Necrozma Dawnwings plus Xerneas. Don't really see much synergy there. Zacian plus Necrozma Dawnwings. Solgaleo plus Reshiram. Solgaleo plus Kieran Black. Eternatus plus Ho-Oh. Calyx Ice Rider plus Zygarde. Calyx Ice Rider plus Zekrom. Calyx Ice Rider plus Reshiram. Dialga plus Ho-Oh. Zekrom plus Ho-Oh. Zekrom plus Xerneas. Zekrom plus Ho-Oh. Calyx Ice Rider plus Eternatus. Dialga plus Xerneas. Necrozma Dustmane plus Zekrom. Actually gonna take Solgaleo Xerneas off the D tier. And that will wrap up the D tier. Overall, this tier is basically where you see the restricteds that, you know, don't share the same weaknesses as we saw in the E tier, but basically, you know, are, you know, can work together, I guess, but they don't really synergize as well. They don't really complement one another. Maybe they have one trick that they could share and maybe help out with, but overall are like pretty weak duo together and don't really synergize well on a team with. So we're gonna move on to the C tier. This is where, like, you know, we get some decent picks. Overall, the duos will usually synergize with each other and have like certain roles that like help one another out, and that's what we're gonna be focusing on. I'm gonna go with Solgaleo plus Yveltal as a pick for the C tier. I think that, you know, Yveltal does complement the Solgaleo. The ground immunity plus the fact that it helps out against Shadow Rider Calyx is really nice. I think overall the Steel Spike and Max Quake boost can really pair up well with Yveltal. And yeah, I think it'd be pretty strong. They do struggle a little bit to hit Incineroar sometimes, which I think is going to be a big thing. Groudon's not going to exactly be a fun matchup, I think, for these Pokemon, but I do think that this is a pretty decent pairing for the most part. It just depends, because Yveltal sometimes can lack out on the damage offensive. It's not like the life or weakness policy set, and these Pokemon might like to play a bit too defensive, so I do put this in C tier. Same thing can be said about the Necrozma Dustplane plus Yveltal. I think it's the exact same pairing here. I think Necrozma plus Palkia is probably okay with each other. Trick Room, they both pretty alike. Palkia has some pretty nice coverage in the water typing to help out the Necrozma's ground and fire weaknesses. I don't think it's too bad, but I don't think they're the strongest restrictions out there. So I think I probably put them in C tier here. Solgaleo plus Xerneas. I think Xerneas, again, is not a really great Pokemon in a restricted format, but at least it gets some other restrictions to help out. And I think like having the Steel Spike and Max Quake boost that can boost up his defenses with a really strong Dynamax user and Solgaleo is pretty nice. So I think that can like be a good synergy. So I would put that in the C tier. So the reason I have Solgaleo plus Xerneas here and not Necrozma with Dustmane as well with Xerneas pairing is because I think Intimidate and Incineroar is really tough, I think, for the Xerneas teams to really initially damage, especially with the common support Pokemon. Solgaleo won't get intimidated, at least with the clear body, so it can usually dish out some pretty nice damage or pick up a knockout and Incineroar with a policy boost, while Necrozma Dustmane can kind of struggle with that. It can also be a problem with the Yveltal, but I think the synergy with the Calyx Shadow Rider probably helps out a bit more here, especially with Yveltal helping out with the typing more. So that's why I'd probably put Dustmane, Necrozma plus Xerneas either in the D tier, or maybe it's like really low C, but overall that's the main reason why I think it would be like in that kind of like order. So one duo I wasn't sure to put in the high D tier or the low C tier is going to be Zacian plus Reshiram. The main reason is I think Zacian is a really strong restricted. I do think it's one of the best restricteds out there. Reshiram, I think it's like a mid restricted, and the thing about this duo is they do share that common ground weakness and don't really complement each other too well. But of course, Zacian just being a super strong restricted, I just wasn't too sure. But I think I'm going to put it in the D tier because I think there are other Pokemon that probably complement Reshiram a bit more. I think just having that ground weakness, a little bit weak to like some sun stuff as well. I'm just not a big fan of it. So I think I'd rather put this in high D tier than a low C tier. Next, Palkia plus Ho-Oh. I don't think this is an amazing duo, but I can see some synergy with the typing, especially offensively, I think. So I think I'd probably put this in the C tier, probably in the lower C tier, as I think they can work well with each other typing wise, but they don't really provide that much otherwise. Calyx Shadow Rider plus Kyurem White. These are really strong attacks that can come out here offensively. These Pokemon can be amazing against a lot of the different combinations, I think, in the format. But overall, I don't think like type synergy wise, they really complement each other at all. That's why I'm going to put in C tier because they're both really powerful restricteds here. Calyx Shadow Rider plus Palkia. Again, same thing as the Kyurem White. They can dish out a lot of damage, but the typing synergy isn't like super amazing. But offensively can help. Palkia can also help to damage Incineroar, which Calyx Shadow Rider does not like facing against. So yeah, I think it is decent here. Dialga plus Ho, I think appreciates just the boost from like Steel Spike, Max Quake. I think having the rock resist is pretty nice in the Dialga, and Ho can help out against the fighting weakness that Dialga has. So I think it's probably a decent pairing. I don't think these restricteds are amazing by itself, and like even as a duo, it's probably one of the weaker combinations, but I think like they do have a bit of synergy, at least with the typing, both defensive and offensively. It's pretty nice. Calyx Shadow Rider plus Rayquaza. I don't think they have much like defensive synergy, but offensively doesn't seem too bad. Rayquaza also helping out with weather is a big plus for Calyx, so I think it's probably decent in the C tier at least. Kyurem Black plus Kyogre, I think is not too bad because Kyurem does resist a lot of what Kyogre is weak to in electric and grass. Not bad against like the Venusaur matchup, so I think overall it's not too bad. Kyogre can just dish out a lot of damage with Water Spout especially, so I think it's probably decent, so I'm gonna put it in a C tier. Groudon plus Solgaleo, both physical, can dish out quite a good amount of damage. Solgaleo's Trick Room can also complement the Groudon. It's not too bad, so I'd probably put this in the C tier. Xerneas plus Zygarde. I'm a little bit confused because I think this can maybe theoretically work. I think the max Quake boost that Xerneas can accomplish might be nice. Zygarde can help out against a few things that Xerneas doesn't like. I think they're both weak to the Zacian if there's no Intimidate and the Zygarde doesn't have coils up, but overall I don't think it's too bad a combination. I was thinking about putting this in B tier, but I felt like it was a bit too high. I think it's like a decent duo. I don't think they complement each other super well, but I think like they have like pretty powerful setups, and a lot of the support Pokemon they do share with like Incineroar, Amoonguss, Rillaboom, so I do think it's probably an okay pairing. I think I'll put it in C tier. Zygarde plus Yveltal here. I think it's probably a pretty decent pairing overall. I don't think it's that bad. I think it's probably a pretty strong C, I want to say, because I think like it's not bad. They do have shared ice weakness, but I think Yveltal's a pretty strong restrict in this format, and I do think that The Zygarde can help out against, again, it's going to be the Zacian if it is set up with the coil at least, or have Intimidate pairing. I think it's not too bad of a combination, so I will put it into C tier. It also helps about the electric and the rock weakness that Yveltal does have, so I don't think it's too bad. Can also hit Incineroar for an okay amount of damage, assuming it's not intimidated. So yeah, I do think it's probably an okay pairing with Yveltal. I'd give it a C tier. Zygarde plus Ogre. I think Zygarde plus Ogre. Ogre, of course, threatens a lot of the Intimidate mons, which are Landorus and Incineroar, so I think like that pressure is pretty big, and you can set up coils while Kyra is dishing out the damage. I don't think it really helps out immensely. Of course, the Zygarde can switch in electric type moves, which Kyra does not like facing against, but yeah, I don't think it's too bad. I'd probably give it C tier because of the offensive pressure that Kyra can set up while having like a bulky setup mode with the Zygarde, which can set up coils while Kyra is dishing out the damage of Water Spout. Zygarde plus Ho, I don't think it's too bad. The rock resistance Zygarde is pretty nice for Ho. The only problem I don't like about this restricted duo is that they really lack the damage output that's like immediate, so they do take quite a bit of like just preparing, weakening your opponent's team, slowing them down, so it can get like out offensed by like really offensive teams, like more powerful restricteds. But I think if played well, can be decent. I think C tier is fine for these two. Zygarde plus Groudon. They do share some common weaknesses in ice usually, but I don't think it's too bad a combination because Groudon, I think with the partners with Zygarde, I think Charizard, Venusaur are pretty decent partners. I think you can also run Incineroar with this. I don't think it's too bad of a combination, so I'd probably put in C tier just because of the fact that Groudon can usually just help out with the Sun. Setting up for like, you know, Zygarde as well is probably not too bad, but overall I'd probably be one of the lowest at C tiers. I also consider maybe a D tier. I don't think it's an E tier, even though they do share the common typing, but yeah, I don't think it's like an amazing duo, but the Sun partners can definitely be a benefit to Zygarde here. Zekrom Groudon doesn't seem too bad. I think synergy wise it's not amazing. They do share the ice weakness, but I think like Zekrom with the big damage output does well against a lot of Kyogre teams. I think that can help out the Groudon at least, because one of Groudon's biggest problems is going to be the Kyogre. So I don't think it's a bad pairing. I'd put this in C tier. Zacian plus Zygarde. I think it's okay. A very powerful steel type to help out with like the ice restricted that Zygarde does not like facing. I think it's a pretty nice pairing overall. I think they do complement each other decently. I think Zygarde's decent against some of the Sun teams that of course Zacian can struggle against. I feel like this duo has yet to be tested really, so I am going to keep an eye out for that, but I think a C tier is pretty fair here because I'm not exactly too sure of like how well like they could set up on each other, but yeah, I think this is a pretty decent pairing, at least I think theoretically, but I'm not sure in practice. Zacian plus Zekrom. Zekrom does well against the Kyogre teams, which at least, you know, Zacian does not like. They do share the ground weakness, so it's not absolutely amazing, and you know, can be pretty weak to the Groudon, so I'd probably put this in C tier. Zacian plus Xerneas is interesting. I think the Fairy Aura boost with the Play Rough from Zacian with the ability with the +1 attack is pretty decent, but overall, of course, not exactly super amazing. They can struggle against a lot of the stuff like Charizard, Sun in general, so I think it's probably an okay pairing, but it's not absolutely amazing. I do think it's better than a lot of the combinations in D or E tier, so yeah, I think a C tier is fine for that. I don't think it's an amazing combo, but yeah, it can work. Necrozma, Dustmane, and Ho-Oh. I think the defense boost that Ho-Oh appreciates, as I mentioned with the Solgaleo plus Ho-Oh before, and the Dialga plus Ho-Oh, I do think is pretty solid, so I definitely put this in the C tier. Solgaleo plus Ho-Oh also going to be in a C tier because of the Steel Spike Max Quake boost that Ho-Oh does enjoy, and it's a pretty decent bulky pairing. The reason I put Necrozma, Dustmane, and Solgaleo with Ho-Oh in C tier is because... And the reason why I think these two are C tier instead of higher is because I think they do struggle to hit bulky waters pretty hard, which I think is pretty important. Like Kyogre can be a little bit of an issue for these Pokemon, so that's why I put it in the C tier. Zacian plus Ray doesn't seem too bad against each other because I think Zacian with Ray, of course, helps out with the weather, and Zacian's pretty strong against a lot of the things, especially the ice restrictions that Rayquaza doesn't like, while Rayquaza helps out against the weather, reduces Kyogre or like water type attacks against Zacian. I don't think it's a bad pairing. I think Rayquaza is a bit of a weird restrict in this format, but I could also see Airstream boosting the Zacian, so I think it's pretty solid in the B tier. I don't think they're like the best typing synergy wise, but I think it's like pretty okay for the most part. Zacian plus Palkia is decent, I think. Typing wise, like synergy wise, I think it's okay. I think Palkia helps out to take the attacks from Kyogre, for instance, that Zacian doesn't like. Palkia is decent against Weather, and I think that this fairy and the dragon that Zacian is able to, you know, take on, I think is pretty nice. So I probably put in a C tier. I don't know if Palkia is like an amazing restricted here, so yeah, I think I'd probably put in C tier. Zacian plus Kyurem Black is the same reason as I gave Zacian plus Palkia. Kyurem is decent against some of the weather teams. I think that Zacian complements some of the Kyurem weaknesses in the fairy and the dragon coordination, and as well as the fighting potentially. I think it's a pretty decent pairing. I'm not sure how good Kyurem Black is afterwards. I think they're better restricted, so I think they just are better pairings in the higher tier. But I do think it's like an okay restricted duo pairing, so I put it in C tier. It's pretty decent, I think, and they do complement each other decently well. Zacian plus Ho, I don't think Ho is that great of restricted, so I think a lot of the combinations will probably stop in C tier. The rock weakness, I think, is a pretty big one, especially when you're probably going to need answers for like Charizard still in the format. So I do think that Ho is not going to be super amazing, but I do think that this combination is okay here. I think they can struggle to hit bulky waters unless you're running Wild Charge on Zacian, which isn't that great of a move. But otherwise, the rock resist, I think, from Zacian, handling some of those. And yeah, otherwise they're a little bit weak to landers. It's not exactly the best. I think Ho is still like a average restricted. I think it's probably in the upper tier, but it's definitely not like one of the higher ones. So yeah, I think pairing wise, it's not a bad combination. But yeah, Ho is not exactly the most amazing restricted in this format. Groudon plus Palkia, it's an interesting one. I think Palkia Trick Room can help complement the Groudon at least for that part, but otherwise, you know, set up the Sun, so that means you probably don't want to use Hydro Pump. I think it's okay if you're not deciding to run Hydro Pump on the Palkia, but overall, I think like defensively, it's not too bad, and yeah, of course, Groudon does help out against Zacian decently, so I think it can complement Palkia okay in that department. So yeah, that's why I put in C tier. Trick Room plus like the coverage isn't too bad here. I forgot to put Zacian plus Dialga. Sorry, there's like a lot of like misses here, but of course it is 240 duos basically, so you got to put them somewhere. I'm gonna put it in D tier because of the fact that I think Double Steel isn't too bad. I think Dialga with Life or Weakness Policy is pretty strong here, and it doesn't really mess up Zacian's game plan for the most part. So yeah, I definitely put in D tier. It's also decent against Kyogre, I think. So yeah, I think it's an okay combination. I think it's higher than a lot in the E tier, but I don't think it's like strong enough to make it past D tier. Yveltal plus Kyurem Black is interesting. They both share a rock weakness, but otherwise typing, like offensively, they can do well against some of the format, especially like Kyurems are pretty good, I think, against a lot of the weather teams, as I mentioned before, and Yveltal is pretty good against like a lot of the psychic restrictors, and there are a lot of them in this format, and can do well against a lot of stuff that's not named Zacian. But I think since Zacian's a thing, it's pretty much stopping them from going really any higher. I do think it's a bit better synergy than anything in D tier, so I'll put Yveltal plus Kyurem Black in the C tier. Same reasoning for Yveltal and Kyurem White as I mentioned before. Xerneas, again, I think Xerneas is a pretty hard restricted in this format because restricted. The dual weakness to Zacian is also hurting, I think, this duo. But I think Kyurem can help out against some of the weather teams, as I mentioned before. It's not bad against the weather teams, and I think that's pretty big. And yeah, so that's why I'd probably put these in C tier. It's not too bad, I feel like. And Xerneas, of course, is a really big threat. But overall, it's not like going to be any higher, I think, than C tier. Same reasoning for Xerneas plus Kyurem White. I'm going to put them both in a C tier. I don't think they're like super amazing. They're definitely probably on the lower C tier, but at least like I think the fact that Kyurems can do decent against Weather and Xerneas can be like really threatening with Geomancy, and opponents still have to plan for that. Yeah, but otherwise they're still really weak to steel types in general, so can't go higher than a C tier here. Zekrom plus Kyogre, I don't think it's too bad of a combination. Kyogre helps out against the ground types that Zekrom doesn't really like. Overall, I don't think it's a bad duo, and Zekrom does resist all the things that Kyogre doesn't like. And yeah, I don't think it's too bad, but they aren't exactly the fastest restricteds out there, so I don't know if it really goes farther than that. Zekrom not exactly the most amazing restricted in this format either, so I'm going to give it a C tier. Same reasoning is going to happen for Reshiram and Kyogre as well. Xerneas plus Dialga, I think, is a C tier. I think I mentioned about Xerneas in steel restricteds before, so I am going to put in a C tier. It does pretty help out with the steel spike and the max quick boost, but overall I think it's pretty weak otherwise. I will put this in the C tier. Groudon plus Dialga. I don't think Groudon plus Dialga is that bad realistically. It's just, I don't know. This combination was used in 2016. I'm still not that big of a fan of it. I feel like it doesn't really help out other than Dialga. Decent against Kyogre, I feel like, but otherwise for the most part, I don't feel like they really share any common ground. I do think Dialga providing Trick Room can be pretty solid at least, and of course Groudon with the Sun partners is pretty strong, so I think it'd probably be Reshiram plus Groudon. I think the Sun, the fact that you can run a fire type of Groudon is pretty nice here. I don't think it's too bad of a combo. It's pretty slow, that's the only thing here, so I don't think it goes higher than C, but I don't think this is a bad pairing at all. Offensively, this can be pretty nice, especially with Reshiram's high special attack and the really strong max flares that it can throw off, as well as like the blue flares, the heat waves. So pretty strong, okay. Xerneas plus Ho, I don't think this duo is really that amazing. I probably put in a low C tier. I don't think synergy wise it's really going to help out, other than like Ho can do okay against, I guess maybe it's decent against the Venusaurs, and of course it's going to be okay against the Zacians, of course, but it is pretty weak to Intimidate. I don't think this is the best duo for like facing Incineroar either. So there's a lot of things that have to be built around, but I don't think it's the worst duo. It's just I feel like it's gonna need a lot of help from the partners. Solgaleo plus Ray. I think having anything to help out against Sun for Solgaleo is pretty nice, and Solgaleo does kind of do decent against Zacian, I guess. So I think it's probably okay to help complement the Rayquaza. I think a C tier is pretty okay for this duo. Same in the Necrozma Dustmane plus the Rayquaza. Solgaleo Palkia doesn't seem too bad either. I think typing wise can be pretty nice. Both have access to Trick Room, but can also like play outside of Trick Room decently fast. I think Boldo's Telepathy with like a Spectrier combination can like work wonders with like weakness policy on the Solgaleo, as well as like the Telepathy on the Palkia to help, you know, speed things up. I don't think it's a bad combination. I think C is pretty okay for these Pokemon. I don't think these are the best restricteds, but I think they're like pretty high at least. So I think like it's a pretty decent duo. Yveltal plus Ho-Oh. Ho-Oh at least helps out. I don't know. This is a weird one because this is like double flying. So it's like both weak to rock. At least they're not both weak to ice. They are both weak to electric though. I don't know. I might put this in D tier. The reason I thought this would be okay in C tier is because the fact that Ho can help out against like Zacian, which I think is a big one. And like Yveltal kind of hard carries because there's just a lot of teams that if they don't have a Zacian or like Xerneas, they can really struggle, I think, against Yveltal for the most part. So kind of tough to say. I actually will probably put this in D tier now that I think about it. Yeah, I'm probably going to put this in D tier. Dialga Yveltal I don't think is a too bad. I think they're pretty powerful restrictions on their own. I think Yveltal is really hard to break through. Dialga with the right set can do decent against Zacian, so I think that's okay for the most part. Otherwise, not resisting ice with Dialga isn't exactly that great to help out for the Yveltal, but at least it resists rock and electric isn't too bad, and Yveltal being that ground immunity, so it's not a bad pairing. I just don't think offensively is that amazing, and can kind of struggle against Incineroar unless you're going for like Life Orb Max Quake or like weakness policy boosted attacks against the Incineroar. But otherwise, yeah, I think it's okay as a duo. Dual Weather, Groudon plus Kyogre. I don't think this is super amazing. I think there's like maybe a few teams that could maybe pull it off, but I just don't think it's amazing here. I think you'd rather go Torkoal anyway, I think, for the most part. And yeah, but I think like at least having like both weather options is pretty strong and like helps out with Venusaur, I think, for the most part. So I think I'd probably put this in C tier. I don't think it's an amazing duo, but I think having the options and the weather partners are pretty strong for it. Xerneas plus Reshiram. At least Reshiram helps out against Xerneas, and Xerneas is always a big threat. Reshiram helps to take care of the Zacian, which is pretty decent against, I think, for the most part. So I think it's okay in C tier. I don't think it's really that amazing beyond that, because otherwise synergy is not super amazing other than Reshiram getting rid of steel types. And I guess Xerneas can help out against like the opposing dragon types, but they do share quite a few weaknesses. In like the Sun can be a little bit tricky depending on like Max Quake Venusaur, of course. And Groudon can be a little bit tough to deal with. Just a lot of Pokemon I think these two don't like facing, but they at least have something that can work together. Necrozma Dawnwings plus Groudon. I think I prefer Necrozma Dawnwings higher than Lunala, just because I feel like offensively it does way better than what Lunala can really accomplish. And I don't think the Shadow Shield is nearly as important, I feel like, for the most part, especially since it's pretty easy to get chip and play around, I think. So yeah, Prism Armor can maybe do work in the Dynamax format. So yeah, I think C tier is fine for like Weather, because like Hard Trick Room can like really accomplish much, like Trick Room, Necroz expanding, like Expanding Force, Moongeist Beam next to like Precipice Blades or Water Spout and Rain can be pretty effective here. So I think it can like do decently well together, but otherwise it's not like super amazing beyond that. So Necroz with Dawn Wings plus Kyogre will also be added here. Calyrex, Shadow Rider plus Ho. As I mentioned before, I don't think Ho is super amazing, but at least Ho Airstream is pretty nice thing for Calyrex at least, and can, you know, be okay. Get the chip damage I think in the end to Zacian with Sacred Fire is going to be decent I think for the combination. I don't think they really help synergy wise, but yeah, against other Shadow Rider Calyxes, I guess Ho's Massive Special Defense can really help out there at least. They are pretty weak to Incineroar though, so I'd put this in the C tier maximum. Xerneas Yveltal, I just never really understood, I think, this duo. Even back in like really early 2019 in general, I just never really understood it. I mean, Dark Aura, Fairy Aura are pretty strong abilities, but I felt like it struggles against hitting Incineroar, and with Parting Shot now, it's really bad, I think, for the most part. I feel like this is going to struggle against like Zacian as well for the most part. I feel like it's just going to have a lot of Pokemon that this duo does not like facing against. It can maybe be decent against some of the pairings though, and I think offensively, like, they can do better than a lot of the lower tiers. So yeah, I probably put in C, but nothing higher really. Necroz with Dustmane plus Groudon, same reasons I gave Solgaleo plus Groudon. I think that, you know, having the Trick Room option with Groudon is pretty strong, and like defensively these Pokemon are pretty bulky for the most part. I think C, but otherwise I don't think they really complement really each other that well otherwise. And yeah, like typing wise it's not like super amazing, but you know, the Trick Room option, decent bulk, I think is pretty strong, like better than a lot of the things at the lower tiers. So yeah, I think C is pretty okay. I don't think it's like really beyond that point though. Eternatus plus Groudon, this is a weird duo, and I mean really weird. They both share the ice weakness. I don't really know if Sun really complements Eternatus that well. I feel like for the most part, I'd probably say not. Maybe Charizard can help out with Eternatus, and having the solar power is nice, but otherwise, I think these are like pretty strong Pokemon. I think Groudon, of course, with the Sun just helps out so much with other restricted. I don't think it's like a bad pairing, but otherwise, I don't think like there's enough typing synergy that can really help out to say that this is like going to go beyond anything past C tier. But I do think, again, it is going to be better than the things in the lower tiers. Necrozma, Dustmane plus Eternatus, I think this is okay for the most part. They do share that ground weakness, and a little bit weak to Shadow Rider Calyrex, which I think is a pretty big one. But yeah, I think it's okay for the most part, because I think these restrictions are pretty decent. Like, each of them are pretty solid. I think for the most part, Necrozma can be a really big threat. Eternatus can be a really big threat. It's just, I feel like together, it's not like that bad. It's just not like amazing either. I think it's like decent at maximum. So yeah, I think C tier is fine for these Pokemon. They are a little bit weak to Incineroar. Incineroar can Parting Shot generally against the entire team, get the Intimidates around, and it can be a little bit hard to stop that. But I feel like having the Steel type can be nice for the Eternatus, at least for the Dragons that are pretty solid against it, I think, for the most part. And I think like having the Steel Spike and Max Quake Boost for the Eternatus can be decent. Xerneas plus Rayquaza, as I mentioned before. Xerneas, I think with anything that helps out against weather is not bad, and yeah, I do think it's like a lot stronger than like stuff in the lower tier. So yeah, I'd say Xerneas plus Rayquaza isn't too bad, because Rayquaza is good against like Venusaur, Charizard, decent against Groudon depending on the matchup. It is a bit weak to Zacian though, so I don't think it can really advance higher than C tier, but it's not too bad if it's not facing Zacian. Kyurem Black plus Groudon, not super amazing. They're pretty slow, I think, for the most part, but I don't think it's that bad of a duo. I think the fact that Kyurem Black can help out against like Groudon's Kyogre weakness with Fusion Bolt and switching in isn't too bad. But yeah, I'd probably put it in a C tier. I don't think it's like super amazing, other than like Groudon being able to help out against Zacian's, which isn't bad for the Kyurem at all. Not a bad pairing, but definitely doesn't really go beyond that. Eternatus plus Yveltal. I think both of these restrictions are pretty strong individually, so I think together it's not too bad. They do share that common ice weakness, which is a bit of a shame, but otherwise Yveltal helps out against the psychic types that Eternatus doesn't like. Yveltal can also switch into the ground type moves that Eternatus doesn't like, and yeah, I don't think it'd be too bad otherwise. And of course there is at least the electric resist that Eternatus provides. damage wise, but yeah, I think it's like okay at the most part. Otherwise doesn't really offer too much synergy, although airstreams can, I guess, benefit the Eternatus, which is a plus. Solgaleo plus Kieran Black and Solgaleo plus Kieran White. I think that Soul is a decent restricted. I think these aren't too bad. I don't think they're the best, but I do think, again, the Kieran's helping out the Solgaleo with the Sun matchup isn't too bad. Also, like, Kieran's are pretty good against the Rain matchup as well. So I don't think it's like too bad for the most part. It's kind of a shame that Solgaleo doesn't resist a fighting weakness. And yeah, that can be a thing. At least the Kieran's not weak to fire for the most part. I don't think it's a bad duo, but yeah, otherwise I think complement wise it's not amazing, but I do think that these two together do provide more synergy than a lot of things in the lower tiers. So yeah, I'm gonna add Kieran White as well with the Solgaleo as a pairing for C tier. Same as well for Necrozma, Dustmane plus Kieran White here. Xerneas plus Palkia is probably okay. I think for the most part I'm gonna put it in the C tier, as Palkia okay against some of the weather stuff that Xerneas doesn't really like. It really just depends on the Palkia set, I think, for the most part. And you know, like, it can hit Incineroar, which Xerneas doesn't really appreciate. Depending on the Zacian matchup though, it can't struggle because of the play rough. Playing around that, it's going to be annoying. I don't think it can go past beyond C, but I don't think it's too bad. I think they can complement each other decently enough. Kyra plus Ho-Oh, it's a weird one. I've definitely used this in 2016. I don't think it's that bad of a duo, but of course the electric weakness is pretty big. I think for the most part you can run a lightning mod, but of course there are a few things. The airstream is pretty nice on Ho-Oh, which Kyra does appreciate here. I don't think these Pokemon are really it though, because Eleki's a thing. I think that they're pretty slow, I think, for the most part, so that can a little bit struggle. And of course, you know, the rain does hurt the Ho-Oh a little bit here, but it really just depends. I don't think it's a bad duo, but I don't think Ho-Oh's that great of restricted. I think it's okay. I think it's upper, but it's definitely not like high. So I think C tier is fine for this duo. Calyx Ice Rider plus Zacian. I think this would probably be high C tier. Like, I could see maybe some stuff, maybe like Colossal, maybe that could work with this. Otherwise, I think the weakness to fire is pretty bad, I think, for the most part. And of course, like, it's like two different modes here, basically. You probably get like a trick room option with Calyx and then like the Zacian that plays outside of it. But yeah, otherwise I don't think they synergize nearly as well with each other. I just don't think that these two are like the best fitting. I think it can work like on a few teams, as I mentioned before. I think the Colossal teams, it can maybe work, but I feel like for the most part that fire weakness being shared and like they're so like different from each other, I think for the most part I think C tier is fine, even though these restrictions are pretty insane. Groudon plus Rayquaza. I don't think this is that good at all. Other than Groudon really helping out the Rayquaza, they're both weak to ice. Groudon can help out, I guess, somewhat because of the fact it's okay against Zacian for the most part. But otherwise, and Rayquaza maybe can resist water. They're both weak to ice, and that's a pretty big struggle, I think. There's not really much typing synergy that really complements, I think, these two. So yeah, I definitely put these in C tier. It's just like they're okay restricted, I think, for the most part, but also like the airlock does hurt the Groudon, I think, especially if it was Primal Groudon, maybe it could be higher. But yeah, I think Sun is something that makes Groudon really good for its partners, and Rayquaza in the game, that's not amazing. So yeah, put that in C tier though, because I think there are some things that can work about this, and like these restricteds are like, you know, pretty decent, I think, for the most part. Groudon's definitely one of the higher restricteds. Rayquaza is a decent restricted, but yeah, I just don't really see it otherwise. Groudon plus Ho-Oh. The Sun is pretty nice, I think, for the most part. Groudon switching into the rock and the electric weakness. They're both a little bit weak to water though. I don't think Ho-Oh is that amazing of a restrict in this format, but I mean, this isn't a bad duo. I think it's nice having that ground immunity with Ho-Oh as well. So yeah, I don't think it's too bad. It's also pretty decent against a lot of Zacian teams and a lot of the Steel teams, I guess, in general. Okay against Xerneas. I don't think it's too bad. It can struggle maybe against Sun Mirror if it depends on the other Groudon, so can maybe be a bit of a struggle. So I'd probably put this in C tier otherwise. Yveltal Palkia. I think Yveltal Palkia is probably okay. They both share weakness to Zacian, so I don't think I could really put it that higher than C. But yeah, Palkia can help out against Incineroar, of course, which Yveltal does struggle against. Yveltal's just really good against a lot of the, I think, restricteds in the format. So yeah, I don't think it's a bad duo, but they don't really share much otherwise. So yeah, I think C tier is pretty okay. Calyx Ice Rider plus the Yveltal. This duo also struggled against the Zacian. I think this is probably high C tier though, because I think like Shadow Rider, like Yveltal's pretty good against, I think for the most part. I think Yveltal's pretty okay against the Sun matchup, which Calyx Ice does struggle against. So I don't think it's that bad of a duo. I think they're pretty bulky as well. They can dish out quite a bit of damage. So yeah, I do think it's a pretty good duo. I just don't think it can really go higher than a C because of the Zacian weakness, which I think is absolutely massive in this format. Final duo, I think that belongs in the C tier, is going to be Ray Ogre. Now you might be thinking Ray Ogre is so good, it's done well in like 2016, 2019. I don't really think that this restricted combo's that good outside of Primal Groudon. It's just really not that good, I think, without Primal Groudon, because Kyogre Water Splash just does way too much to Groudon anyway. At least you get the Airstream boost for Kyogre, and of course I guess the Airlock. I mean, the Airlock kind of hurts Kyogre more, I think, unless you're facing that Sun team specifically. And if you're not facing a Sun team, it's not really that valuable. At least Kyogre can be okay against Zacian depending on the set. I think the Airstreams can help out, and yeah, they're decently slow though, which I think is not exactly amazing. But yeah, I don't think it's a bad restricted duo. I think they are pretty strong individually as well, but together I don't think it's like absolutely amazing without Primal Groudon being a thing in the format. So I think C tier is okay for these. I don't think I could really see this in B tier either. Maybe like mid. I think mid C is probably like where I would put this anyway. I don't really see it in high C either. All right, we're up to the B tier, and this is basically where the duos are like pretty good. Like the synergy is really well, I think, for the most part. Just kind of misses it a little bit compared to the A and the S's, but I think that this tier is probably where a lot of the good duos are, where you could really see here. So okay, I think first ones are going to be Necrozma, Dustmane plus Zygarde, as well as Solgaleo plus Zygarde. I think it's a pretty strong duo. It's just I'm not sure how well I'm going to feel about Zygarde yet. I could maybe change my opinion, but I think Zygarde was pretty decent against like some of the Sun teams that we've seen. And I do think that the Steel Spike Max Quake boost isn't too bad. They do play pretty defensively, I think, for the most part. I think synergy wise is pretty fantastic with like the ice weakness that Zygarde has, as well as the fairy, as well as the dragon that the steel types do manage. And like damage output wise, Solgaleo and the Necrozma can really dish out the damage, while setting up, I think, for Zygarde to set up some coils while under those defense boosts, going to make it really hard to KO Zygarde. So I think like, yeah, I think it would probably be in the B tier. I think they are a pretty good pairing, I think, overall, and are pretty solid against like a decent amount of the restricteds. Like a lot of the Yveltal teams, Calyx Shadow Rider teams can also struggle against Zygarde, especially if it has a plus special defense boost as well. Like it's quite insane how much Zygarde can tank. I think Solgaleo plus Eternatus is going to be also in B tier. Now, the reason I have Solgaleo and Eternatus in B tier and not Necrozma Dustmane as well in the B tier is because of the fact that Solgaleo can't get intimidated, which I think is a little bit better in the situations overall. And yeah, I think the Solgaleo being faster also kind of helps out for the most part. So I do prefer, I think, this duo in the B tier because Solgaleo can't get intimidated. That means the policy boosted attacks can knock out Incineroar, which I think makes a huge difference. Making sure that there's a parting shot in, as well as the Steel Spike boost does help out with the Eternatus. And yeah, I think for the most part it's like an okay duo. They do share the ground weakness, but I think that's like manageable for the most part. And yeah, I don't think it's a bad duo at all. Zacian plus Kyurem White. I think Zacian's just really strong. I think Kyurem White's a really strong restricted, especially with Freeze Dry. Absolutely insane damage output against like a lot of the weather teams. I think that this can be a really strong duo, can really hit a lot of stuff in the meta for good damage output. Really hard to stop, I think, the combination. And yeah, I think powerful wise, I think it gives it a B tier. I don't think their typing is good enough for like an A or S, but they are pretty strong Pokemon individually and can hit really hard. Calyx Shadow Rider plus Eternatus. I don't know if this is a B or C. I'd probably say low B, high C max. So I think the reason I put in B is I think Shadow Rider Calyx is absolutely insane, and I think Eternatus, like how fast it is, this duo can really pick up some quick knockouts. Their damage output is pretty good as well. Otherwise, typing synergy wise doesn't do great, but I think the offensive capabilities that this duo has is pretty solid, I think, for the most part, which is why I'm going to put it in B tier, because I think these things can pick up some really fast knockouts against a majority of the format, which I think is pretty huge. So yeah, that's why I'm going to put it in B tier, I think. Dialga plus Kyogre. I think Steel plus Water restricted in Kyogre is pretty insane for the damage output. I think this duo is pretty nice. I think for the most part, pretty bulky. Trick Room's pretty nice. I think for the Kyogre, I do think that these complement each other very well. I think for the most part. I think the only problem is unless the DL is Policy or gets a Policy boost or Life Orb, it can a little bit miss on the damage output, but I think Kyogre Water Spout just is absolutely incredible. And the Dialga really helps out with the Kyogre's weaknesses. And of course, Kyogre can really help out damage wise against like the ground types that Dialga does not like facing, which is pretty big, as well as Incineroar, which likes to punish out Dialga. So I think that's a pretty nice mix right there. So I think this duo is pretty strong. I think a B tier is pretty solid for this. Same reason for Necrozma, Dustmane, and Kyogre. I think Kyogre handling most of the restricted. A pretty good pairing with the Steel type, I think, in general. I think they're all solid. I think both of them are going to be B tier. I think they hit pretty hard for the most part. The Trick Room option, again, is solid for Kyogre as a backup. I do think that these are pretty strong options. So yeah, I think a B tier is pretty solid, I think, especially since I think the max on the Steel types can really help out with the defense boost on Kyogre as well. The policy damage output from these Pokemon can be pretty insane too. So yeah, I like these in B tier. Kyogre plus Eternatus is interesting. I think this is also a B. This could also be C, I think, potentially. I do think Eternatus, maybe I'm giving a bit too much credit, but I do think the damage output that it has is pretty good. I think Kyogre can really help out with the ground weakness that the Eternatus does share, and its high special defense makes it pretty decent against a lot of the psychic restricteds for the most part. I don't think it's a too bad pairing, especially since Eternatus helps with the faster. It's pretty good to take on the Kyogre weaknesses, which is electric and grass. And yeah, and of course Kyogre can switch into the ice weaknesses that the Eternatus does suffer against. I think this is definitely a B or C though, because of course weakening like the fire move that Eternatus can carry can be a little bit of a downside. And not really the best speed control, but I do think it's like not a bad pairing. So I think I'd probably put in B because this damage output that these two can really drive is pretty good. So Yveltal plus Kyogre, I think is a B tier. Now, I think both of these are like some of the top restricteds in the format. I think they're definitely some of the best restricteds in the entire format. They do share that electric weakness. I don't think it's too bad. Yveltal can go for like airstreams. The damage output can be pretty nice. The speed for Kyogre is pretty solid. And yeah, otherwise the shared weakness for electric does kind of like lower it, I think, to B tier, but these Pokemon are like really strong both individually and I think as a combination for the most part. So I do think that a B tier is pretty solid, I think, for these duo. And yeah, there's not really much else to say, I think, for it. Palkia plus Kyogre, I think the double water is pretty nice. The Trick Room option that Palkia can do, or it can be like a really fast Life Orb variant, can dish out a lot of damage, I think, for the most part. So I think it's probably a B tier just because of like the typing synergy wise with like the rain, I think, in general. And they don't share any of the common weaknesses, which is pretty nice. And the Palkia coverage is pretty good. Palkia, of course, the boosted Max Geysers or Hydro Pumps can really dish out the damage. The Trick Room setup for Kyogre as well as an option. I think that this is a pretty okay duo, so I think I would put them in B tier. Xerneas plus Eternatus, again, I might be ranking Eternatus a bit too high, but I think Xerneas is always something that you have to watch out for. I think that is a pretty big thing, and Eternatus isn't that bad, I think, for the most part. This might be a C tier, realistically. This might not be the strongest duo, I think, combination-wise, but I think you gotta respect Xerneas, and I think Eternatus can be scary under the right positions. And I think like a lot of the support Pokemon, they will probably share like Incineroar, Rillaboom, I think for the most part will complement like both of them. I think for the most part it's probably B, like really low B or high C, but I think like the pressure that Xerneas can emit and the damage that Eternatus can throw off is pretty solid, I think, for the most part. So yeah, I would put them in B, I think, right here. Kyurem White, I think Kyurem White's a really strong restricted. I think it's definitely in the upper tiers. I think Kyurem White can go really well with like the weather pairings. I think Kyogre and Kyurem White dish out a bunch of damage overall, I think, for the most part. So I really do like the damage output that both of these Pokemon can really throw out. Otherwise, speed isn't that amazing, so I think that's what's holding it back. But otherwise, it's pretty solid. Base 170 special attack, and then the water moves in the rain can really dish out a lot of damage. I think this is the B tier because of how like threatening both of these Pokemon can be, and like it can be hard to switch into Water Spout and like Freeze Dry, for instance, the combination. Groudon plus Kyurem White, I think Kyurem White's pretty strong. I think the Suns can be pretty nice because I think the support Pokemon can help out with the Kyurem, I think, for the most part. So yeah, I really do like this as a combination for the most part. Groudon can also help out the Kyurem here because of the fact that it does decent against Zacian, I think, for the most part. So, or the Steel restricted. So yeah, I think it's a pretty strong B tier. They're not that fast, that's the only downside, but I think like the weather setter strong damage output. Like, I think together it's pretty strong. So I think B tier is pretty solid for Kyurem. Same with Calyx Ice Rider with Groudon. I think the ice typing isn't like amazing. I think this is probably the highest Calyx can really go. But I think Groudon does help out with, again, Zacian for the Calyx. The Sun Partners is pretty strong, I think, for the most part. So I do think it is B tier. Same with Calyx plus Kyogre. I think offensively, like, can really dish out. The Trick Room option is pretty solid. And, like, Glacial Lance Water Spell can be, like, really tricky to switch into for the most part. I think like that damage output can be pretty crazy. So yeah, I think a B tier is pretty strong. But otherwise, I don't think like they're amazing enough to reach like the A or S tier. But I think they're like pretty strong. They have some pretty good options, I think, and like really threatening damage output. Zacian plus Eternatus. Again, I might be overranking Eternatus, maybe, but I think Eternatus plus Zacian is pretty okay for the most part. I think Zacian is one of the best restricteds in the game. Eternatus, I think, is high up there. I think like the damage output, especially since like you gotta watch out with your Dynamax, because you have Dynamax Cannon and Behemoth Blade that are really threatening, and not much can really switch into, I think, either one. So yeah, can be easily losing your Dynamax Mon with like these two out on the field, and I think that's like a pretty big thing to respect. So that's why I think I give it a B. I think it's probably like a lower B. I'm not really like listing these probably like from like in order, but for the most part, I do think it's a pretty fair thing to like respect, because you got to play well for your Dynamax against, I think, these two, which I think is like a pretty important factor. All right, Xerneas Groudon and Xerneas Kyogre, I think both are in B tier. Now, not sure, because I think Xerneas is like a mid restricted, because I think it's really hard to set up Geomancy, but I feel like for the most part, it's not too bad. Groudon, I think Sun support is pretty solid. Of course, ground with fairy coverage is absolutely insane for the most part. Special defense boost can really help out. Geomancy Xerneas is always a threat you got to watch out for. Groudon with Swords Dance can also be a big threat. The Sun attackers can also be really threatening. So there's just like a lot of output that could really be a thing with this duo. I think it's like a really strong combination for the most part. Something you definitely have to respect. I just don't know how Xerneas is going to be, because there's Zacian out there. So I don't think it's going to be just as strong as it was in previous restricted formats in like 2019, 2016. I don't think it's going to reach that range, but I still think it's something you absolutely have to respect, I think, for the most part, which is why I'm going to put it in B tier. And I think Kyogre Xerneas, I can honestly see this as a C tier, and that's coming from the guy who absolutely loves his Xerneas plus Kyogre. But I feel like with Zacian is a pretty big thing, and Kyogre can miss knockouts because of Dynamax, so Water Spout, it might not be safe to Geomancy in some positions. It can be pretty scary. So I do think that it is hard to set up the Geomancy for the most part, which is why I probably can't rate the Xerneas team, I think, higher than B tier, especially with Zacian is like one of the most common restrictions in the format, and Dynamax kind of like makes Geomancy really hard to set up, I think, for the most part. So yeah, I do think that Xerneas can be really strong though, especially with like the spread moves and the coverage that Groudon and Kyogre both provide. As well as Calyx Shadow Rider plus Xerneas, kind of like the same thing as I mentioned before. I think like this is probably weaker than Kyogre plus Xerneas. Definitely weaker than Groudon plus Xerneas. But the thing is, Astral Barrage is something you have to watch out for. I think this duo is more manageable because Incineroar can be a little bit tricky to handle, I think, for the most part. But I think that you just got to respect the Astral Barrage, and if like you're able to position correctly, like threatening the Astral Barrage damage, and Xerneas is able to get Geomancy while like Calyx is threatening some knockouts, you really gotta respect them together. So that's why I think that this combo is a B tier at least, because there are some really strong threats that you really have to like know your positioning, I think, for the most part. So that's why I'm gonna put it in B tier. I think that wraps up the B tier, I think, for the most part. Now we're gonna move on to the A tier, which is probably like the most solid restricted duos, maybe just having one or two flaws that's just holding them back, I think, from the S tier. So in A tier, let's start off with Yveltal plus Groudon. I think like both of these Pokemon can be hard to KO. They're not exactly the fastest, but they can be extremely obnoxious for some teams if they don't have a Kyogre, especially. Can really be like, or Kyurem, can be really hard to knock out because of like how bulky Yveltal can be, especially with an Assault Vest. Groudon is really bulky on the physical side. You got a lot of partners like Incineroar, Venusaur, Charizard that could be really threatening, I think, with this duo as well. I think it could be insane. Like Groudon's pretty good against like the Zacians that really threaten the Yveltal, while the Yveltal can be really good against like a lot of stuff like the Calyxes, for instance. Kyogre, especially if there's sunlight, can be really hard to like damage the Groudon otherwise. So I think for the most part, this duo is pretty strong. That ice weakness, I think, is like the one major flaw of what's holding it back, especially if you add the Venusaur. But I think partners wise, it can be pretty solid, I think, for the most part. And yeah, I do think it's a pretty good duo. So I would put it into A tier. Next duo, I think, is going to be the Yveltal plus Calyx Shadow Rider. I don't know. This could be a B tier as well. I do think that offensively, this could be a bit weird, but I think like as some of the top restrictions in the format, I think it's pretty strong for the most part. Especially since Shadow Rider Calyx mirrors are really annoying. I think the fact that Yveltal helping can be pretty nice for that, I think, for the most part. Airstream's always appreciated on the Calyx. Of course, Incineroar can be a little bit of struggle against. Zacian can be a little bit questionable, but if you chip it, the Calyx Shadow Rider can usually finish it off, which is pretty nice, I think, for the most part. So yeah, definitely could be a B tier. I think I'm going to put an A tier because I think both of these restrictions are like some of the top, maybe like top 3, top 5 in the game. So yeah, that's why I would probably put an A tier. Otherwise, I think it can be a B tier combination because of like how strong the damage output can be. And yeah, otherwise, I think it's like pretty okay for the most part. I think like how fast the Calyx Shadow Rider can be can really threaten a lot of stuff, especially that Yveltal might not appreciate. And yeah, I do think it's an okay duo. Next is Shadow Rider Calyx plus Groudon. I'm not sure how strong this duo is. I think like having the speedy Shadow Rider Calyx, the strong spread moves, I think in general, the fact that these are probably some of the top restricted in the game, I think for the most part, I think are pretty strong, especially with the Sun as a like pretty good support Pokemon, I think. So I do think that this team has like a lot of advantages to being offensive, and I think that's like pretty good here. Strong spread can really threaten, I think, a lot of like what you could bring against it. So I probably put this as an A. It could be a B. Like I do think it could be a B tier, but I think like again, these restrictors are probably like top 5 in the game. So I think like A tier combination is probably okay, especially since like they can really threaten a lot of knockouts, I think, and dish out good amounts of damage. 4, I do think that these two Pokemon are probably like top 5 restrictors in the game. I think Shadow Rider Calyx plus Zacian. I think it's just like how fast they are, how much damage they can dish out is absolutely insane. I think that it should be an A tier pairing because of like how powerful I think these restrictors are. Maybe could be a B tier. I think all of these could technically be B, but I think like these are a little bit better than the ones in the B tier, so that's why I'm putting them in A tier, because I think they're like slightly better just because of like their placements in the restricted and like how much damage that they can dish out. But yeah, I do think that these are pretty solid, I think, for the most part. I think the fact that the speed tier is like really hard to match, especially if you're running like really fast stuff like Eliki and like Tailwind, I think it's like really hard, and these Pokemon can just dish out a bunch of damage, I think, for the most part. Zacian helps out against Yveltal, which and other dark types that Calyx doesn't really enjoy facing, which I think is pretty huge. And Calyx is just really strong and can hit really hard, especially against like some stuff like some of the Psychic Steel restricted like Solgaleo and Necrozma that Zacian doesn't like facing. So yeah, I think for the most part, I do think that this is a pretty good duo, especially with like the max Phantasm combinations that the Shadow Rider Calyx can throw off, and then hitting them hard with his Zacian attack. I think that's what makes this for me an A tier combination. Same can also be said for Shadow Rider Calyx plus Groudon. I think Zacian plus Calyx Shadow Rider does a bit better, but yeah, that's another reason why I just think these are A tier combinations. Final duo in the A tier, I think, is going to be Groudon plus Zacian. Now, I think this could also be argued for an S tier combination. I think like Sun plus Zacian is just really strong, and the fact that you have Groudon as well to help out against other Zacians can be absolutely insane. I think the only reason I'm playing this as A is my bias towards Groudon. I just think like Precipice Blades is always a move that can be like, you know, if you hit it, it's amazing, but if you miss it, it's like pretty bad. Even if you're maxing the Groudon, I feel like you're gonna probably be maxing a lot of the other stuff anyway. I feel like you're probably maxing Charizard or Venusaur more than you are gonna be maxing Groudon. I think like when you're using Groudon, you're using it more for the Sun and helping out with the other restricteds, while not having like another fire type into Torkoal, so you can run Incineroar in that slot instead and not share the same weaknesses. So that's why I think like Groudon's probably better there, and that's why I think it's better as an A tier Pokemon, because I don't think it's like putting in that much work as well. But you can max the Groudon in situations, but I do think the fact that you're probably going to have to hit quite a few blades is like really something that I don't like, and that's the only reason I'm really putting A tier. But otherwise, I think Sun plus Zacian is just absolutely insane. We've seen it back in previous series, and yeah, I do think that this duo can be really strong with the Sun support mons. But yeah, I think the Precipice Blades that Groudon probably has to hit is what's like holding it back, I think, into the S tier, because I think you have to run Precipice Blades absolutely. And that is the A tier. These are pretty strong restricted duos. Some of the best in the game just have probably one flaw, I think, one or two flaws that like hold it back from the S tier. Now we got 3 restricted duos to enter the S tier, which is the best of the best. We are going to start off with what I think is going to be the Zacian plus Yveltal. I think both of these are pretty strong. I think that Yveltal helps out with the ground immunity, which is pretty nice. It's pretty bulky. Both of these Pokemon are pretty bulky. Airstream is pretty nice for the Zacian, and I think like helping against Shadow Rider Calyrex, which Zacian can kind of struggle against, I think is pretty big. It also helps out against some of the steel restricted opposing Zacian, like Solgaleo and Necrozma. I think it's pretty strong for the most part. It's pretty consistent. Foul play, does a good amount of damage, can do okay against some teams. I think it's pretty solid, I think, for the most part, and I'd give it an S tier. It can be a little bit awkward, I think. Damage wise from the Yveltal can be a bit questionable, but I think that they have some really strong partners and supports. I think this is a really strong duo and definitely does belong in the S tier though. Next is going to be Calyrex Shadow Rider plus Kyogre. I think this is absolutely solid because Astral Barrage, Water Spout, insane amounts of damage. It's crazy, and I think it's something that has to be well respected, especially with like some tricks that Shadow Rider Calyrex can pull off. It gets like some support moves like Trick Room, Speed Swap, but of course those are more gimmicky. But overall, I think like in a competitive setting, this can really work well just because like how much damage these Pokemon really throw off, and I think not really much weaknesses there. The fact that, you know, Incineroar is one of the most troublesome Pokemon for Calyrex to deal with. Kyogre just absolutely nukes that with a Water Spout. That can be really good partners, and yeah, I think just Kyogre Water Spout just dishes out a lot of damage. So like, you, even if it doesn't pick up knockouts, Calyrex Shadow Rider can come in, just throw off Astral Barrages, pick up those knockouts, and then get the boost. I think it's a really strong pairing. Last duo, which is probably the strongest, I think, restricted duo because of typing synergy and offensively. Zacian plus Kyogre. I loved this fairy type with Kyogre, and I think Zacian does it absolutely well at steel typing, of course helping out with Kyogre with the grass types, but also the Kyogre dishes out so much damage to those fire and ground types that Zacian does not like facing. I think the damage output is crazy. Behemoth Blade, Play Rough, Water Spout, and Rain just does absolutely insane amount of damage, especially with like common support Pokemon like Incineroar or Tornadus, which I think are really solid. Amoonguss, there's a lot of good support Pokemon I think for this duo. They dish out a bunch of damage. They're pretty decently bulky for the most part. They throw off insane amount of damage. It's just crazy. I think this duo is super strong, and I do think it's probably the best, but maybe not. Maybe we'll see. I do think it probably is right now, but I think that we could definitely see, I think, the others take over. But I do think it's a really strong restricted duo that has to be feared. It is a really good combination. And if you need one more glance of the tier list, here it is. This is the tier list, and we have ranked over 240 restricted duos, potentially over 300 if we count like the F tiers, because they can combo like a bunch. But yeah, let's not do that because this video was probably already really long. And that is the official tier list completed. So many duos. I didn't even realize when I first thought, when I had this idea, I thought like, oh, this will probably be okay. And then I didn't realize, oh, there's like 240 possible duos that you could really have. So I tried to make this as quick as possible. If you did enjoy it, please leave a like down below. It does help me out. Let me know in the comments whether you agree, disagree, what you think about Series 12 as the rule set. That is going to be 7 months. Let me know all that stuff in the comments down below. But otherwise, you can check out more of my content. I'll still be doing Series 11 until, you know, we move on to the Series 12 officially on the Stadium ladder. Maybe I'll do some Series 12 here and there stuff. Let me know what you think about this kind of content and subscribe for more. But otherwise, thank you all for tuning in. Have a great day, people. And until we bow again, I'll catch y'all later.